Alaikum to everyone on the call. Thank you so much for joining. I am really honored to have received this invitation and was really pleasantly surprised and happy to participate. So I also really appreciate the introductory remarks that were just given. And I think right now we are in a moment where it is really important to see, especially with what has been happening in Gaza for the past year and a half, just the way in which these colonial, imperial, settler powers engage, not just obviously in Palestine, but also India, as it is increasingly resembling Israel in Kashmir, but elsewhere as well. So it is urgent and really important that we continue to have these kinds of conversations. So I'll be talking about my book today. Okay, so I'll just begin talking about the book. So this book, Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation, came out in July 2023. And Alhamdulillah, it has received an interesting reception. I've talked about it in a lot of different universities, student groups, campuses. An Indian edition of the book was published under a different title called A Fate Written on Matchboxes, State Building in Kashmir under India. Obviously, for purposes, I'm sure you can all imagine, they wouldn't allow the original title for the India edition. And I think one thing that I wish I had more of an understanding of is how this book is being read or understood in Kashmir itself. But unfortunately, as many of you may already probably know, the situation right now, especially since 2019, has become very difficult. People are not able to speak out. There's little journalism, just whatever resemblance of a civil society we had pre-2019 has been completely demolished. So one of the things that I sort of regret is that I'm not able to see how people in Kashmir are reading and engaging with this history. But at the same time, I am grateful for the opportunity to be able to interact with a lot of different people and communities around the world. And so I hope that you'll find some interesting resonances with this talk, and I really look forward to your questions. So I'll begin. If you read or hear Indian state officials, journalists, and commentators talk about the region of Kashmir, you'll often hear the phrase that Kashmir is an integral part of India. The repetition reaches a hysterical frenzy and seems to be the one thing that everyone across the political spectrum, from the Nehruvian secularists to the right-wing Hindu nationalists, can agree on. Challenging this mantra, my book examines how Kashmir was made integral to India. Building on recent interventions in the field of critical Kashmir studies, Colonizing Kashmir historicizes India's relationship with Kashmir as a colonial occupation and argues that one of the key mechanisms of effective control by which India's colonial occupation of Kashmir in the post-partition period took place was through the installation of local client regimes, as well as the particular forms of state building and governance that took place under these regimes. You might be wondering how India, which is often valorized as a post-colonial power with one of the kind of more mythologized anti-colonial movements in the world, how India can also be a colonial power. But part of what this book aims to do is rethink how we understand colonialism and also how we understand India's state formation. There remains an attachment in scholarship, especially on South Asia, to seeing colonialism as something that emerges from the West to the global South and situating our present moment as a decolonial one. This approach fails to account for power dynamics within the global South, such as that between India and Kashmir, as well as the ways in which post-colonial nation states are also colonial. And one of the reasons why these colonial dynamics remain obscure is that the idea that there's some kind of cultural cohesion or geographic contiguity makes it a less visible sort of colonialism than is usually seen as with what happens overseas with Britain and the subcontinent. But another reason involves something called methodological nationalism. And decades of work and scholarship on Kashmir, primarily by Indian scholars, have naturalized the Indian nation state form and denied its coloniality. And as a result, they've refrained from critically examining how the relationship between India and Kashmir was constructed in the first place. This has resulted in what I've referred to as epistemological violence on Kashmir, because it's very similar to the Indian state's own national narrative that Kashmir is integral to India. And so you see this with a whole host of scholarship that exists that seeks to explain what happened in the late 1980s when there was an armed rebellion and mass popular uprising against the Indian state. And every so often, you have these articles coming up in the Indian media or in academic circles asking why Kashmiris are feeling alienated or estranged from India. And in this body of work, the Kashmir issue is reduced to a crisis of federalism, a crisis of democracy, of course, words like separatism, secessionism, ethno-nationalist insurgency, and also, of course, terrorism. So my book examines how colonialism, settler colonialism, and occupation are all important analytics to understand India's relationship with Kashmir. That is to say, India uses characteristics of each of these categories to cement its rule in Kashmir over time, and so it's difficult to say that it's just one or the other. This is important because it encourages us not to see these categories as in opposition to one another, but working in tandem in different moments to achieve particular ends for the state and also to respond to local forms of resistance. So I'm not interested in asking why a people who never felt that they belonged suddenly became estranged or alienated. Rather, I'm interested in a set of inverse questions. How did India acquire Kashmir without the popular consent of the people? How did India and its client regimes normalize its occupation both within Kashmir but also for the international community? And what were the different modalities of rule that were in operation at this time? So, to answer these questions, I look at a decade in Kashmir's recent history from 1953 to 1963. In August 1953, Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad, who's pictured on the left, led a coup against the state of Jammu and Kashmir's first Prime Minister, Sheikh Abdullah, who's pictured on the right. At this time, the entire princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which had its own history of a monarchical struggle against its princely rulers, the Hindu majoritarian Dogras, were split between the two new nation states of India and Pakistan after the First India-Pakistan War of 1947 to 1948. The United Nations had called for a plebiscite to take place once hostilities ceased so that Kashmiris could determine their future. And part of the territory, as you see here, northern areas, which is now Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir, came under Pakistan's control, and the territories in orange came under Indian control, which is often referred to as Indian occupied Kashmir or the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and of course, just sometimes simply Kashmir. And so the Indian occupied Kashmir is where I conducted my research. Right from 1947, India began to colonize the part of Kashmir under its rule. It placed its own client regimes in power and negotiated some level of autonomy, which was enshrined in something called Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. The article itself was a colonial treaty meant to placate these client regimes into thinking that being under Indian rule would provide them with some sort of autonomy. On paper, it allowed the state to have its own constitution, lawmaking body, and the leader of the state was even called a prime minister. Residency rights of land ownership and employment were restricted to Kashmiri state subjects. The Indian government was just supposed to be in charge of communications, defense, and foreign affairs. Yet the first Prime Minister, Sheikh Abdullah, who had initially agreed to Kashmir's accession to India, began to backtrack. He was increasingly concerned with rising Hindu nationalism in India, as well as the Indian government's attempts to erode Kashmir's autonomy. He was removed in a coup by India and replaced by his deputy. Bakshi was in power for a decade from 1953 to 1963. He was a shrewd politician and had been an overground worker for Abdullah's National Conference Party, and so he was very familiar with local politics. The Indian government tasked him with promoting Kashmir's contested accession to India, both domestically as well as internationally, while also repressing popular aspirations for merger with Pakistan or independence. After violently quashing protests that arose in the aftermath of Sheikh Abdullah's arrest, Bakshi turned his attention to state building and implemented a number of educational and economic policies. And during his time in power, the Kashmir Assembly was basically filled with National Conference loyalists, people who didn't agree with Kashmir's accession to India, were not allowed to run for office or elections. And so that assembly is also what essentially confirmed accession to India and sought greater financial and administrative integration with the Indian state. So Bakshi's period oversaw crucial shifts in India's political and economic relationship with Kashmir towards concrete material integration. But Bakshi also knew that in order for his rule and the accession to be legitimized, Kashmiris had to be convinced that this relationship was in their best interests, and they had to develop an emotional bond in favor of India. Bakshi was also compelled to respond to the economic and social aspirations of the people, a majority of whom were Muslim, who had long suffered unjust economic and social policies under their previous rulers. So, what's astounding about his state building project is that he left no stone unturned in transforming the state and utilizing a range of actors, from bureaucrats, educators, the cultural intelligentsia, workers, peasants, tourism operators, and Indian filmmakers for this purpose. With financial assistance from the government of India, the Kashmir government established a number of public institutions and development projects, including schools, colleges, and universities, hospitals, roads, tunnels, irrigation, and power projects, as well as cultural centers, stadiums, and social welfare organizations. So the two photos that you see here are from the 1956 opening of the Banehal Tunnel. And this was basically for before this tunnel was built, there was actually no all year round link between the Indian mainland and Kashmir, because the road that sometimes would, the road that some people would take through the mountains, because again, this is mountainous terrain, it was closed for almost half of the year because of snow. And so this tunnel was actually a huge feat. It was almost 2 miles long. It cut through the mountains. They brought in German Indian engineers to build this tunnel. And even at the opening of this tunnel, Bakshi basically said that this will finally allow for the emotional and national integration of the people of India with Kashmir, because now we have this all year round link. So what I think that's really important because a lot of people kind of don't know that especially before 1947, most of the trade, educational trips or education that Kashmiris did, business, commercial activities, like marriages, families, actually were in the western side. So what eventually became Pakistan, places in Punjab like Lahore, Sialkot, etc. So those were the ties that Kashmiris had for a long time, not necessarily ties with the Indian mainland. So when I began my research over a decade ago, I found that most of the scholarship primarily focused on the 1947 partition and then the period after the late 1980s, which is when this armed rebellion begins against the Indian state. And so there was very kind of critical scholarship, very little critical scholarship to help us understand this time period in between, and that's why I was drawn to it. The dominant narrative of this period in popular memory to a certain extent, but also in scholarship, is that things were, quote, normal during this time, and that it was only later because of Pakistan's interference or India's lack of commitment to development or secularism or democracy that Kashmiris became disillusioned. And that's what eventually led to the rebellion and the intense militarization and human rights violations committed by the Indian Army. So we may associate development works and efforts at prosperity by the state by building roads, tunnels, irrigation, increasing employment opportunities, and enhancing tourism as laudable or good things for people of a region. But I argue that it is precisely through the ruse of state building that India colonized Kashmir through client leaders like Bakshi. The decade that Bakshi was in power consolidated the contours of India's colonial occupation by relying on these discourses of development, secularism, integration, normalization, and democracy. And I historicize India's occupation and show that it may have looked different in this time period in comparison to what happened in the late 1980s with judo militarization, but it was still invested in suppressing Kashmiri demands for freedom. So the different chapters in the book look at the ways in which this occupation, this colonial occupation took place, specifically through international diplomacy, film, tourism, education, economic development, and also cultural reform. So these two photographs are from a very high-profile visit by the Soviet premiers at the time in 1956, who, with the invitation of Nehru and Bakshi, were invited to come to Kashmir and see the kind of quote unquote progress or development the state had made. And so you can see here, obviously, Bakshi in one photo is feeding, I believe it's Khrushchev, Gushtaba, which was a Kashmiri meat delicacy. In the other photos, they're sitting in a car like a cavalcade and they're going through the crowds. And basically, the Soviet leaders were shown schools, plays, all the quote unquote development and progress that India was doing in Kashmir. And it was a very significant visit in that after the visit, the Soviet leaders made an announcement saying that it's clear to them that Kashmiris had given their approval to Indian rule, and that India was actually progressing the region. And so subsequently, this issue, which was still kind of at large in international forums at the United Nations, whenever a resolution would come up on Kashmir, the Soviets would exercise their veto power. And so this visit in many ways domesticated what was at that time still an international dispute. And one of the things I found during my kind of my own research, I did an oral history, or I interviewed someone who was actually present at this rally, and what they told me was that many of the people had been driven in buses from villages and smaller towns across the valley. They had been told that they would get a free lunch and a free bus ride to the city. And all they had to do was line up on the side and just cheer as kind of a car or a delegation came by. And so people didn't know what they were cheering for. They just, thought that it was a free lunch. And that excitement or whatever people were doing was then seen by the Soviets as consent for Indian rule, which it obviously was not. So I will kind of talk about two main kind of themes that I explore in the book. The first is what I call the politics of life. And basically, to give you a sense of what the politics of life was, I'll share kind of another anecdote. So in Kashmir, there were a number of, at the time when I was doing my research, there were a number of bureaucrats who had recently passed away. And so when people would talk about them, they would say things like, oh, this person hadn't even passed 10th grade and look how they died and they were in such a senior position. And so I began to find out that, especially in the 1950s and 60s, Bakshi would come across young men from different towns and villages, ask them if they had any education, and based on whatever they told them, he would grant them jobs on slips of paper, or sometimes on matchboxes, which is why the title of my India edition is A Fate Written on Matchboxes. And so this is what the politics of life was basically about, where I argue that in the early years of India's colonial occupation in Kashmir, the Indian government and Kashmir's client regimes saw the Kashmir issue not in political terms, meaning not a question of sovereignty or self-determination, but rather in economic terms, linked to a better standard of living. Kashmiris were depicted as being malleable, that while they may have had varying political aspirations, they had the potential of being integrated subjects as long as they could experience the benefits of Indian rule. And so both governments thought that they could basically buy over Kashmiris through state planning. And they attempted to show Kashmiris what was possible for them by living under Indian rule. And so I argue that the early decades of India's colonial occupation were marked by the politics of life, and I borrow this term from the scholar Nev Gordon, who uses it similarly to describe how Israel attempted to create prosperity in the West Bank and Gaza Strip after the 1967 war by promoting agriculture, building trees, permitting Palestinians to build colleges, and even boasting of having raised the calorie intake amongst Gazans. The politics of life refers to how the Indian government and its client regimes propagated development, empowerment, and progress to secure the well-being of Kashmir's population and to normalize the occupation for multiple audiences. It entailed foregrounding the day-to-day concerns of employment, food, education, and provision of basic services. At the same time, as in Palestine, questions of self-determination and Kashmir's political future were being suppressed. And this approach was actually furthered all the way up to the Prime Minister of India at the time, Nehru. This is basically what he writes about Kashmiris, that they are gifted in many ways, they're intelligent, they're in their artisanship, but he says that they are not a virile people. They are soft and addicted to easy living. The common people are primarily interested in a few things, and just administration and cheap and adequate food. If they get this, then they are more or less content. And Nehru's also once reportedly to have said that India would bind Kashmir in golden chains. And it did. It intended to ensure that with an improved standard of living and greater prosperity, Kashmiri Muslims would shift in favor of India. Now, the reason why this is important, the story of the politics of life is important, is that colonial occupations or colonial and occupying powers utilize a variety of modalities of control in regions that they've colonized. And I basically look at how India uses not just kind of necropolitical, meaning the politics of death, things like torture, killings, assassinations, but also things like the politics of life, and sometimes even at the same time. At other times, one would be given more focus than the other. So while a state governing through death and life may appear to be in contradiction, it's actually not. The idea is to entrench colonial rule and to transform political subjectivities. And so, depending on the context, this can be done through manifest violence or through strategies that seek to win hearts and minds. And one of the main examples that I look at in terms of how this was done through economic development is through the allocation of rice to Jammu and Kashmir. So during Sheikh Abdullah's time, Sheikh Abdullah actually wanted some sort of financial autonomy for Kashmir. He didn't want to take funding from the Indian state because he felt that that would undermine Kashmir's autonomy. But that meant that the local government didn't have enough funds for local development projects, and it also had to increase the price of rice. And so after Sheikh Abdullah is ousted from power to kind of suppress the protests, one of the primary things that Bakshi does is actually receive significant subsidies for rice from the Indian government and lower the price of rice to a very strong extent. But what's interesting is that in the negotiations between the Indian government and Kashmir on, the annual amount of rice that Kashmir would get, Bakshi is always asking for more tons of rice, and the Indian government is kind of pushing back and saying, "Look, we gave you this much last year. I don't know, we don't know why you need this much more. So you should please reduce the amount that you're asking for." But in the communication with the Indian state, he basically would say that the position of Jammu and Kashmir was materially different from other states. There were other political factors the government of India should not risk with the state, as numerous political implications were involved in the distribution of rice at reduced prices. And so eventually the Indian Ministry of Home would then write to the Ministry of Food and Agriculture and request them to take into consideration the special circumstances of the state. And so the state would then give more rice to Jammu and Kashmir. And so I look at how integral this rice subsidization policy was to India's colonial occupation. It was very different from how India dealt with um, giving rice to other states, in other Indian states. With other states, India would basically encourage people to rely on scarcity and self-reliance. And yet, with Kashmir, the government of India had to have a very different development strategy. And that was precisely because they knew that if people were upset or, were unhappy with the access to resources, then they may start to have more of kind of a political agitation. But what I think is interesting about this story is how Bakshi was basically able to leverage political instability in Kashmir to try to get more food aid for Kashmir, sometimes to the sheer dismay of Indian officials. And so he envisioned a political economy where Kashmir is basically receiving a significant amount of aid from India. And to get the most out of India, all he had to basically say was that he was subject to certain political compulsions or sensitivities. And this abundance of aid and money from India was basically meant to remake sentiments towards India. And if Kashmiris could see the benefits of joining Indian rule, then they would consent to the accession. So this is basically how the politics of life operated. And in subsequent years, the diets of Kashmiris also began to change. They became a lot more eating rice, right, was a lot more common because it became more accessible. And so the story kind of shows how colonial occupation is not always a one-way process. It also encourages those who are in the middle, a comprador or sort of collaborator class, to further and manipulate as well. And so this explains in part why it becomes intractable. But what happens as a result of this is that given that the Kashmir state is taking so many funds and so many subsidies from the Indian government, India is then able to position Kashmir as a begging bowl and basically make the claim or the argument that Kashmiris themselves cannot be self-sustaining or that they can't basically, exist on their own without Indian aid. And so ultimately, even though there are these kind of short-term games that the Kashmiri state or Bakshi is able to make, in the long term, it actually further entrenches India's colonial occupation in Kashmir. Okay, so the second and final theme that I'll talk about is this question of secularism and what the secularism entails if India's colonial occupation in Kashmir is grounded in the context of what India claims is secularism. So Indian leaders like Nehru would basically say that India's secular ideals are exemplified through the fact that its only Muslim majority state, Jammu and Kashmir, had decided to join India. And so you might think then that when it came to representations of in domain, Kashmir's Muslim histories or geographies might be made reference to, especially if they were supposed to have upheld Indian secularism. But this was not the case. To say that Kashmir was a Muslim majority region that had and so yeah, so basically it's this attempt to kind of show this place as like a playing ground for Indians that are coming in from the mainland. They can go to Kashmir any time of the year, rest there, rejuvenate themselves, and experience the beauty of the land, but also specifically the people as well. And so this kind of narrative, of course, has continued up until today. If you saw this poster here from the 1950s, it says Kashmir calling. And so very similar language is even used here. This was in 2020, the abrogation of special status, when the attempts to bring in Indian tourists have even skyrocketed even further, again, to kind of create this place as a territory of desire for Indians. So using film and Twitter, I argued that representations of Kashmiri history and identity were partial, selective, and distorting, ignoring complex historical processes and providing a very simplified narrative of India's or Kashmir's natural incorporation into the Indian nation. In their travels, Indian tourists saw and experienced Kashmir in ways that legitimated India's symbolic claims. And in tourist guidebooks, Kashmir's Muslim histories were either completely erased or, as is what happens across the subcontinent, relegated to stories of invaders. Muslim rulers were referred to as conquerors, whereas earlier Buddhist or Hindu rulers, despite their varied origins, were seen as indigenous to Kashmir. Muslim sacred sites were given a brief, if at all, mention, whereas Hindu sacred sites were central to the tourist experience. Few of the Kashmiri films that you even see here, these were many films from the 1950s and 1960s, even portrayed a Kashmiri Muslim character, which is which is surprising given that majority of the Kashmiri population was Muslim. And so the erasure of Islam and Muslims is very evident through these cultural representations. It was also in this time when Hindu pilgrimages, religious tourism to Kashmir was strengthened. As one guidebook mentioned, Kashmir was a holy land for Hindus, and Benares stands as a molehill before a mountain. And so many guidebooks also had a special section on the Amarnath pilgrimage, highlighting the significance of Kashmir for the Hindu faithful. And I basically make the argument that part of what the Indian state is trying to do here is settler colonial. They're using settler colonial logics of how they claim the land as Hindu. And at this time, they're just trying to kind of assimilate the greater Kashmiri Muslim population. In many ways, taming the Muslim within the Kashmiri Muslim and having it align more towards this kind of Hindu, secular, syncretic being. And that in itself is also linked to settler colonial logics of assimilation as well as erasure. So different aspects of the state building project created its own subversions. Bakshi was replaced by the Indian government once he stopped serving their purpose, and that's the fate of many of Kashmir's client politicians even up until today. And even though his time in power completely entrenched the financial, legal, economic, and social infrastructure of colonial occupation, it did not actually succeed in emotionally integrating Kashmiris to India. In fact, the decades after his rule led to even greater popular movements for self-determination. So I wanted to kind of end by bringing this whole history into the present. I'm sure many of you know that on August 5th, 2019, India basically embarked on the next phase of its settler colonial project in Kashmir by revoking Kashmir's semi-autonomous status. And since then, it's not an exaggeration, as I was referring to earlier, to say that Kashmiris have been effectively silenced, as India has changed a series of laws to allow its citizens and armed forces to buy land and settle in this region in order to change the demographics in favor of Hindus and quash a longstanding movement for self-determination. And these developments are also happening under a brutal neoliberal order, which is also making Kashmir a site for global extraction as well as environmental destruction. In recent years, the Indian government has completely gone after all forms of civil society, from imprisoning the pro-freedom leadership to targeting writers, journalists, artists, academics, human rights defenders, and activists in a variety of ways. Writing or saying anything that portrays the Indian government's actions in a negative light, not to even speak of freedom or azadi, is a cause for harassment, interrogation, and imprisonment. Much of this is also being replicated in India as political developments under Modi's Hindu nationalist government have led to fears of genocide against Indian Muslims. Examining Indian state formation from the perspective of Kashmir sheds light on India's perceived descent into an authoritarian, undemocratic Hindu majoritarian state. In scholarship and advocacy efforts against Hindu nationalism, there's a tendency to reinforce the idea that India was once secular, pluralistic, and democratic, but it has only now succumbed into this ethno-nationalist state. There's, of course, no question that Hindu nationalism has exacerbated India's challenges and things have gotten worse, but that with this increasing nostalgia for an earlier version of India as a result of rampant Hindu nationalism in India today, the inherent violence of that liberal secular order, as well as its entanglements with Hindu majoritarianism, is erased. This nostalgia completely erases how colonialism and domination were at the root of Indian state formation, not just in Kashmir, but in other places as well. More importantly, Kashmir and the other regions at the frontiers or margins of the national narrative are not an exception, but they remain integral to India's state formation as a colonial power. In some ways, we can see Kashmir and other zones of occupation as a test case for the Indian state to practice various forms of power: disciplinary, sovereign, biopolitical, and necropolitical. These strategies would be utilized in the mainland, especially against populations that are deemed a threat: tribals, Muslims, Dalits. Zones of colonial occupation help us think through how the nation state can slide into varying political formations, because it's often these zones that go from being a state of exception to the norm. And so that's that's basically the story of India's state formation that I'm trying to narrate with this book. And finally, one of my hopes and aims, as you could see from the reference to Palestine and also the image from Hawaii, is that it will be useful to understand other places that are like or have some similarities with Kashmir, and that it will contribute to more literature on these places that have not been, have not been allowed to exercise their liberation or their freedom, have been denied their sovereignty. So many nations and communities around the world have been brought into the fold of modern nation states without their consent, and they remain under colonial occupation. And so modern states, as a result, have used different modalities of control, whether it's manifest violence or things like the politics of life, to establish their rule in places where they lack legitimacy. But people have, and they continue to, of course, resist. So that's my presentation. I have an Instagram account where I sometimes share updates of additional writings or archival material from my work in case anyone would want to follow. Okay,